Have you ever wondered how a great king dies? Not in battle, not on horseback, not in the glow of victory, but quietly, in bed, surrounded by silence, age, and the soft flickering of candlelight. Tonight, we'll drift slowly into the final days of King Henry VIII, the famous Tudor monarch of England. You may know of his 6 wives, his split from the Catholic Church, or his once towering strength. But this story isn't about that. This is about how he faded, how a man once feared by all came to his end, not with a roar, but with a whisper. It is January of the year 1547, and the cold hangs heavily in the air like a thick, unmoving fog. Outside Whitehall Palace, the River Thames is nearly frozen. Icicles cling to the stone walls. Inside the palace, a deep quiet has settled. The great halls, which once echoed with music, feasts, and royal declarations, now feel heavy, as though the walls themselves know that something is coming to an end. In a large chamber dimly lit by flickering candles and the faint orange glow of the fireplace, Henry VIII lies in his great bed. The bed, carved from dark oak and draped in rich fabric, looks more like a throne laid flat, but the man in it no longer resembles the warrior king of earlier years. He is bloated, his skin pale and stretched, his legs badly ulcerated. His once powerful body has become a burden, too heavy for even the strongest servants to lift without effort. Henry's breathing is slow and uneven. His chest rises and falls like the tide, sometimes halting long enough that those watching fear it may not rise again. His eyes open only rarely now, and when they do, they reveal confusion, as if unsure of where he is or who is around him. For all his past power, he now lies helpless, tended by servants who no longer fear his wrath, but pity his pain. The courtiers and physicians move quietly. No one speaks the word death aloud, because it is still forbidden. Even now, at the end, the myth of Henry's invincibility clings to the air. Yet they all know the end is near. The king is dying. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, Henry's old companion and religious advisor, sits by his side. The room smells of lavender and burning herbs, meant to mask the scent of infection. Cranmer holds Henry's hand gently. It is swollen, the skin cool to the touch. The king cannot speak, but Cranmer leans close and whispers a soft prayer, not for healing now, but for peace. The king has not eaten in days. The ulcers on his legs ooze through the linen wrappings. His body is failing, quietly, completely. There are no cries, no royal proclamations, only stillness. Outside, snow continues to fall, blanketing the roofs of London, softening the sharp edges of the city. Inside, the once thundering heart of the English throne beats slower with each passing hour. By the evening of January 27th, the chamber has grown even quieter, as if the room itself is listening for the king's final breath. A handful of attendants linger at the edge of the bedchamber, their footsteps muted on the stone floors, their faces expressionless beneath the flickering candlelight. The king's breath is ragged now, uneven and shallow, each inhale followed by a longer pause. He is drifting between sleep and unconsciousness, and no one is quite sure how long he has left. Outside, the frost clings to the windows, forming delicate white feathers along the edges of the glass, and the wind whistles softly down the long palace corridors. It is cold, but the fire in the hearth keeps the king's chamber warm, casting shadows across the heavy drapes and polished floors. Henry, once the towering figure of English majesty, now looks small under layers of fine linens and fur-lined covers. His eyes flutter open for a moment, unfocused, then close again. He does not speak. He hasn't in hours. No last words, no grand declarations, just silence. The room is filled with the faint scent of herbs, a mixture of rosemary and camphor, meant to purify the air. But it does little to mask the rot in his legs or the slow failure of his organs. The doctors have already withdrawn, knowing nothing more can be done. Cranmer remains at the king's side. He watches, he waits, and when Henry's hand twitches, almost imperceptibly, he leans forward and offers one final blessing. There is no sign that the king hears it, but Cranmer does not stop. He keeps speaking softly, gently, as if he were reading a child to sleep. The others in the room remain still. No one dares move too suddenly. The weight of history is settling around them like dust. At 2 a.m. on January 28, 1547, King Henry VIII of England takes one final breath, shallow and slow, and then none at all. His chest stills, his jaw slackens, and just like that, after 37 years on the throne, the king is gone. There is no thunder, no divine sign, no heavenly chorus, just the soft crackle of the fire and the sudden, irreversible stillness of the room. For a few moments, no one says a word. Then Cranmer closes the king's eyes and murmurs the final rites. The room holds its silence, as if the very stone is in mourning. Outside, London sleeps, unaware that its monarch, the man who broke from Rome, who ruled with iron and ceremony, has left this world in silence. The news will not be made public right away. For now, the palace doors remain shut. The windows are drawn. The royal guards maintain their post with unreadable expressions. The death of a Tudor king is not merely a private affair. It is a national turning point. But at this moment, there is no fanfare, just preparation. The body will need to be embalmed. A difficult task. Henry's size is such that his coffin will have to be specially made, long and wide, lined with lead and velvet. The servants who enter the chamber to begin the process will do so with covered faces, not for ceremony, but because the smell has already grown unbearable. They work carefully, respectfully, but quickly. Time is not a luxury. Outside, the frost continues to harden the ground, and morning has not yet broken. In a few hours, someone will ride north to inform Prince Edward, just 9 years old, that he is now king. The boy will be pulled from his bed, dressed in formal robes, and told what has happened with as much gentleness as court etiquette will allow. He will not cry. Tudor heirs are not allowed tears, but inside, the weight will begin to settle. A child monarch now sits at the helm of a vast kingdom, and the man who once called himself England's lion now lies still, embalmed in silence. The king is dead, but the world must not know, not yet. In Tudor England, the death of a monarch is not simply a moment of grief, it is a moment of danger. A dead king leaves a throne empty, and power, even briefly unguarded, invites chaos. So, for a time, the truth is hidden. Only a small circle of trusted men know what has happened behind the thick velvet curtains of Henry's bedchamber. The palace remains quiet. Orders continue to be signed in his name, and beyond the palace gates, Londoners go about their daily lives, unaware that their king has already drawn his last breath. Within Whitehall, courtiers whisper in low tones, messengers are dispatched under cover of darkness, slipping out through servant corridors and side gates. One rides north toward Hertford Castle, where young Edward, the king's son, is waiting. Another is sent to Windsor, another to the Archbishop of Canterbury. Each man carries the same message, written not in ink but in code. The king is gone. The wheels of state must begin to turn before the world catches on. Meanwhile, inside the palace, the body is being prepared. The chamber has been cooled with open windows despite the freezing air outside. Servants wrap the body in waxed linen. The ulcers on his legs have worsened. The stench is overwhelming. To mask it, they burn bundles of dried rosemary, sage, and juniper in small iron dishes placed at the corners of the room. The fire crackles quietly as it consumes the herbs, sending up thin columns of gray smoke that curl and drift lazily through the air. The embalmers work slowly. There is great care taken to preserve the body, not only for burial, but for dignity. For a man who lived with such display, who demanded splendor in every corner of his court, even death must be dressed in pageantry. They clothe the body in a heavy crimson robe stitched with gold thread. They place a rosary beside him, though he had long ago broken from Rome. And when the wrappings are complete, they close the chamber doors and post guards on either side, their armor catching faint candlelight in the stillness of the corridor. The coffin is being constructed in secret. It will be large, lined with lead, and sealed tightly. But it is not ready yet. So for now, the king waits. And so does the country. The bells have not yet tolled. The streets are not draped in mourning cloth. But inside, preparations are well underway. The coffin has been completed. It is massive, shaped from thick oak, lined with lead, its corners sealed with wax. The interior is cushioned with velvet and linen, and upon its lid, artisans carefully affix a small golden plate bearing the royal arms. It does not say Henry VIII. It simply says King of England. Simpler than you might expect, but death often strips away the titles, leaving behind only the barest truths. When the time comes to move the body, the palace is shrouded in silence. Heavy curtains are drawn. Torches line the hallways, casting long, dancing shadows across the stone floors. The guards wear black sashes across their uniforms. No one speaks louder than a whisper. The sky is a pale gray, the sun hidden behind a curtain of clouds. Snow has fallen during the night, and it crunches softly beneath the hooves of the horses. The wind is light but steady, brushing against the faces of those in attendance like a ghost passing by. There are no crowds lining the streets yet. That will come later. For now, this part of the journey is quiet, a private farewell. The carriage creaks as it begins to move. Guards on horseback ride beside it, their heads bowed, their armor dulled for mourning. Behind them, noblemen ride in pairs, their cloaks heavy with winter, their faces unreadable beneath layers of fur and wool. The road from London to Windsor is long and winding. Along the way, the world seems to slow down. Villages pass by, smoke rising lazily from chimneys. Fields lie empty, dusted with snow. Trees, bare of leaves, stand silently like sentinels. Birds call in the distance, but even their cries seem softened by the cold. Each evening, the procession stops. The coffin is carried reverently into a church or manor house. Candles are lit, prayers are whispered. The air is filled with the scent of tallow and beeswax, of damp stone and burned pine. Local priests perform quiet vigils, their Latin words blending with the wind outside. Then the body rests again, watched over through the night. And so the journey continues, not quickly, not loudly, but slowly, respectfully, as if time itself has been asked to walk more gently for the passing of a king. By the time the procession reaches Windsor, the mood has changed. The air feels heavier, not because of grief alone, but because of the long silence that has been held for days. Now, the public must be told. The world will learn what those inside the court have quietly known, that Henry VIII, the King of England, is gone. Church bells begin to toll across London and throughout the countryside. Slowly at first, then with solemn rhythm. Black cloth is hung across city streets. Windows are draped in mourning linen. Priests lead public prayers in every village. In churches, both great and small, candles flicker on altars beneath stained glass. As the people gather, not in loud sorrow, but in reflective hush, at Windsor Castle, final preparations are underway. St. George's Chapel has been chosen for the burial, a place of quiet majesty, where light filters softly through high stone arches and echoes linger in the hush of prayer. The coffin is brought inside at dawn, when mist still curls across the grounds and frost clings to the blades of grass. Inside the chapel, the air is cool and still. The vault where the king will lie is already open, a dark rectangle in the stone floor. The ceremony is formal, though understated. Dozens of nobles are present, dressed in deep blacks and muted grays. The young King Edward is not there. He has been spared the sight. His council stands in his place. The choir sings softly, Latin hymns that rise and fall like waves, ancient melodies that fill the chapel with warmth despite the chill in the air. The coffin is lowered into the vault with great care. It rests atop the remains of Henry's beloved third wife, Jane Seymour, the queen who gave him a son. They are reunited now, beneath stone and silence, bound together in the quiet of death. The slab is replaced over the vault, sealed with mortar, and draped in velvet for the duration of the rites. But even in death, things do not go entirely as planned. Somewhere along the journey, while the coffin rested overnight at Sion Abbey, something peculiar happened. A servant, half drunk and curious, had claimed to see a strange sight. The coffin, he said, had leaked. Fluid, dark and foul, had begun to seep from the wood onto the stone floor. The story was never confirmed officially, but it was repeated. And in time, it became part of the strange afterlife of Henry's legacy. Whether it truly happened or not is impossible to say. The funeral is marked as successful, the burial noted with ceremony, the vault closed and undisturbed. But the people remember stories more than silence. And for centuries, the whispers would linger, adding a curious footnote to the strange, solemn farewell of England's most infamous king. England begins to settle into a new silence. One era has ended, loudly in life, but quietly in death. And a new one begins, uncertain and small, in the hands of a child. Henry VIII is gone, but what remains of him? Not the booming voice that once echoed through courtrooms and banquet halls. Not the wide shadow he cast across council chambers. In the days and months following his death, what lingers is something else, something softer. Was he a tyrant, or simply a man shaped by dangerous times? Was he a visionary, or a creature of impulse and appetite? But in the quiet aftermath, the people thought more about his habits, not his policies, about the king who once hunted in Windsor Forest until dusk, whose laughter could be heard across Hampton Court kitchens, whose robes were lined with fur even in summer, and who never quite walked, but thundered. His palaces stood still now. The fountains in his gardens continued to bubble, but the man who ordered them built would never sit beside them again. His books remained on the shelves. His suits of armor, some no longer able to fit him, were polished and stored in silence. His dogs had been passed on to new handlers. Even his favorite musicians had gone quiet, their lutes and flutes left untouched in the corners of chambers that once rang with evening song. One by one, his personal items were inventoried: jewel-studded goblets, carved walking sticks. Even his prayer book, the one he kept near his bedside, was quietly removed and sent for safekeeping. And in his stead, England now had a new king, Edward VI, just a boy, delicate and thoughtful, with eyes that watched more than they spoke. A boy raised among tutors and courtiers, suddenly lifted into a throne once warmed by a giant of a man. The realm belonged to him now, and those who had survived the previous king knew, gently, carefully, that everything must change, but only just enough for the people. Life continued. Markets reopened, bread was baked, ships still left port, but in fireside corners and quiet gardens, people told stories of the king who married 6 times, who built cathedrals and burned bridges, who feared no man but limped in pain each day. They spoke of his armor, his appetite, his stubbornness, but also of his generosity, his strange charm, his unpredictable warmth. In the end, it is always the small things that survive longest. The sound of his boots in a hallway, the way he tapped his fingers on the table when deep in thought, the scent of his gloves, a mixture of leather and lavender oil. The little details, too soft for books, too gentle for statues, but forever carried in memory. When Henry VIII was alive, he gave much thought to how he would be remembered. Like many rulers, he envisioned a grand tomb, a resting place fit not just for a king, but for a man who had reshaped an entire nation. His plans were elaborate. He imagined tall marble columns, golden angels, and an eternal flame that would flicker beside his effigy, day and night, watched over by monks or gentlemen in quiet devotion. The designs were drawn up while he still breathed, and materials were gathered. Craftsmen were consulted. Artists were invited to submit sketches. It was said that even Michelangelo was once considered. Henry did not want a modest tomb. He wanted something majestic, something that would speak to future generations of his power, his reign, and his enduring presence in the life of England. But death does not always wait for construction, and the king died before the tomb could be built. After his burial in St. George's Chapel, the plans remained, tucked away in royal archives, passed from one steward to another. Pieces of the tomb were stored in workshops and storerooms, carved panels, heavy statues, blocks of white marble waiting to be shaped. For a while, there was hope that it might still be completed, but the years passed, priorities shifted, funds dwindled, monarchs changed, and slowly, quietly, the plans were forgotten. Henry VIII's tomb was never built. Today, if you visit St. George's Chapel, you will find no grand monument to the man who once ruled with such weight. No statues, no columns, no golden angels. His grave lies beneath the floor, under a simple black marble slab that names not only him, but also Charles I, another monarch buried in the same vault after the turbulence of civil war. There are no carvings to tell you of Henry's reign, no eternal flame to mark his legacy, just a few lines of text etched into stone. It is a strange thought, that one of England's most famous kings lies beneath the floor in such quiet company, almost hidden in plain sight. Visitors walk across the slab each day, perhaps unaware of who rests below. And in that way, Henry's afterlife became the opposite of his life, not grand and visible, but hushed and unnoticed. His dreams of an immortal monument gave way to the quietest of memorials, and yet, perhaps, this is fitting. For a man who spent so many years commanding attention, there is a gentle peace in the idea that in the end he lies beneath a simple stone, without spectacle, his story whispered rather than shouted, carried not by monuments, but by memory. Time, as always, softens even the sharpest of legacies. As the years stretched onward after Henry's death, his image began to change. The man who once stood flesh and blood became a figure of folklore, shaped not just by historians, but by the slow, dreamy work of stories passed down from grandparents to children, from quiet servants to curious scribes, and eventually from old books to modern ears. In these stories, Henry is often larger than life, a king of immense appetite and impossible temper, a man who could be generous one day and ruthless the next. People said he laughed like thunder and sulked like a child, that he played music in his youth and crushed rebellions in his age, that he composed ballads and ordered executions with the same hand. But as the edges of truth blurred, something quieter took hold, a gentler version, the one people imagined when looking back from the safety of sleep and distance. Some said his ghost still wandered Hampton Court Palace, moving slowly through the long galleries at night, that his heavy steps echoed after midnight, especially on winter evenings when the fog curled against the windows and the halls were hushed. Guards and caretakers whispered of faint music heard in empty rooms, of doors opening on their own, of cold drafts brushing past even when the air outside was still. Were these tales real, or just the dreams of people who had read too many pages of Tudor history by candlelight? Others believed that Henry's spirit remained not in palaces but in the land itself, in the great oaks of Windsor Forest, in the worn stones of the old abbeys he had ordered dissolved, that the echoes of his choices, his fears, and his ambitions still hummed beneath the surface of the English countryside, just faint enough to be missed unless you were very quiet and very still. Even the story of his death became a thing of whispers. The leaking coffin, the delay in announcement, the long journey in the frost. These were not moments you'd find carved in marble, but they lived on because they were strange and human and softly unsettling. The kind of stories people tell not to scare, but to wonder. And then there are the dreams. Some say Henry appears in dreams, not as a towering king with a jeweled hat and booming voice, but as an older man walking alone in a garden just before dusk. Quiet, thoughtful, perhaps even a little sad. The kind of presence that says nothing but leaves you feeling as though you've been visited by history itself. In this way, Henry VIII remains, not in the way he planned, not in stone or gold or eternal flame, but in the shadows of stories, in the worn corners of chapels, in the quiet footsteps of those who pause just a little longer on the black stone that marks his grave. Because some legacies do not roar, they whisper, and some kings, in the end, are remembered not for their crowns, but for the silence they leave behind. They say behind every great man is a great woman, but behind Henry VIII there were 6. Not all at once, of course, one by one, over the course of his life. These 6 women entered his world, each with her own story, her own hopes, her own quiet dreams. Some were loved, some were feared, some were mourned, and some, simply, were forgotten too soon. But each of them, in her own way, helped shape the story of England. And each one carried a piece of Henry's story in his heart, whether or not he realized it. It all began with Catherine of Aragon, a princess of Spain. She arrived in England young and full of promise, first married to Henry's older brother, Arthur. But when Arthur died and Catherine remained, she would later marry Henry himself, a match both diplomatic and, at first, filled with affection. For nearly 2 decades, she was queen, steady, pious, and proud. She bore Henry a daughter, Mary, and waited long for a son. But time passed, and Henry grew restless, and when he could not secure the annulment he desired, the rift between them became history and the beginning of England's break with Rome. Then came Anne Boleyn, bright-eyed and sharp-tongued. She had captured Henry's attention with wit and mystery, refusing to be his mistress and demanding instead to be his queen. Their courtship was long and tangled, filled with letters, promises, and controversy. When they finally married, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, but no son followed. Court whispers grew louder. Henry's patience wore thin, and in the end, Anne was tried and executed, her head taken by a French swordsman, her body buried in the Tower grounds. Her legacy, however, would live on in the daughter she left behind, a future queen in her own right. Next was Jane Seymour, quiet and gentle, said to be the only wife Henry truly mourned. She gave him what he longed for most, a son, Edward. But the joy was short-lived. Jane died just days after childbirth, and Henry grieved in a way he had not before. He had her buried in St. George's Chapel, and later he would choose to be laid beside her. Of all his queens, Jane was the one who gave him a male heir, and the only one who would share his tomb. Then came Anne of Cleves, a princess from the German states. Their marriage was arranged by portrait, and when Henry finally met her, he was said to be disappointed. The match was never consummated, and the marriage was annulled after just 6 months. But unlike others, Anne survived her time as queen, given a generous settlement and a title of king's sister. She remained in England, living peacefully in the countryside, attending court events quietly, always keeping a polite distance. Next, Catherine Howard, young and lively, barely more than a teenager when she caught Henry's eye. She was his 5th wife, and perhaps the one whose fate was most tragic. Accused of unfaithfulness, she was executed in the Tower, her brief time as queen ending in silence and sorrow. Some say her ghost still lingers, running down the gallery of Hampton Court, crying out for mercy that never came. And finally, Catherine Parr, wise and patient, who became more nurse than wife in Henry's final years. She read to him, helped manage his household, and served as stepmother to his children with kindness. After Henry's death, she remarried, only to die shortly after childbirth. But she was remembered fondly and with dignity, the final wife of a king who had once burned bright and ruled loudly. 6 women, 6 paths, some crossed in silence, some in splendor. Each one faced a king who changed with time, from a golden youth to a wounded, aging man. And each one left her own quiet mark upon the royal history of England. Their lives were not just chapters in Henry's story. They were stories of their own, of strength, sorrow, resilience, and grace, whispered gently across the centuries, long after the crown passed to other hands. Though Henry VIII had many hopes, he had only 3 children who who lived long enough to be known by history: Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. 3 names, gentle on the tongue, yet heavy with the echoes of an empire. They were born to 3 different queens, raised apart, caught in the ever-turning wheel of court politics, religion, and expectation. And yet, each would wear the crown in turn, a rare thing, even in the long tapestry of royal bloodlines. First, there was Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. She grew up under a sun that slowly faded. At first, she was cherished, a princess, educated and refined, the apple of her father's eye. But as Henry's heart turned away from her mother, Mary's place at court grew fragile. Declared illegitimate, separated from her mother, she endured long years of uncertainty, yet she never broke. When she finally became queen, she ruled with strong hands and a solemn heart. Her reign was short, and though she tried to bring England back to the old religion, her efforts would not last. History would come to know her as Bloody Mary, but behind the title was a woman shaped by loss, faith, and a deep, lonely desire to restore what she believed had been taken from her. Next came Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's only child, red-haired and clever, born into controversy. Declared illegitimate after her mother's death, she spent her youth navigating careful silences and learning whom to trust. But she watched and listened and learned. When she finally came to the throne, she brought with her not only intelligence, but a rare and quiet strength. Elizabeth ruled for more than 4 decades, a reign of poets, explorers, and a slowly changing world. They called it the Elizabethan Age, and in time she became a symbol of resilience and power. Yet she never married, never bore a child. She died alone, the last Tudor monarch. But her legacy was vast, and her memory would never be forgotten. And then there was Edward, the boy Henry had waited for, the son of Jane Seymour, born in hope, raised in care. He became king at just 9 years old, a child with a crown far too heavy for such small shoulders. He was intelligent, studious, devout, but his reign was shaped by protectors and counselors who made decisions in his name. He ruled for just 6 years before sickness claimed him. He died at 15, quietly, leaving behind little but uncertainty. A boy king, remembered more for what might have been than what was. 3 children, 3 monarchs, each marked by their father's legacy, yet shaped by their own paths. Henry VIII had dreamed of a powerful dynasty, sons and sons of sons, all wearing his name. But instead, his line ended just 1 generation later. His 3 children, the girl he cast aside, the girl he feared, and the boy he barely knew, became the full measure of the Tudor afterstory. And in the quiet spaces of time, we see them still. Mary, solemn and devout, walking through chapel halls with folded hands. Edward, pale and thoughtful, reading by candlelight. Elizabeth, standing alone in her court, watching shadows move across the floor, wondering what it meant to rule as a woman in a world of men. They were not just heirs, they were echoes of a father's choices, of a kingdom in transition, of a name that once roared but ended in a whisper. To speak of Henry VIII is to speak not only of kings and queens, but of courtiers, the orbiting stars of a powerful center. The Tudor court was more than a palace. It was a world within a world, with its own unspoken rules, its own rituals, and a rhythm all its own. Here, everything mattered: a nod, a smile, a silence. To walk through those gilded halls was to perform every hour of every day. The court moved as Henry moved, traveling from Hampton Court to Whitehall, from Greenwich to Windsor. Each location was not only a royal residence, but a stage upon which politics were played in slow, subtle steps. It smelled of rosewater and beeswax polish, of roasted meats and damp stone. It sounded of lutes being tuned, fabric swishing, pages turning, and once in a while the quiet click of a locked door. For the nobles and ladies who served, every moment was one of calculation. To speak at the wrong time, to dress too plainly or too extravagantly could mean disaster. There were favorites, of course, men and women who seemed to shine under the king's gaze. But favor was a flame that flickered quickly in Henry's world. What burned bright today might turn to ash tomorrow. Perfume was not just decoration. It masked the odors of life in stone-walled rooms, yes, but it also told stories. Lavender to soothe, musk to suggest power, rosemary to protect. Scent was a language, and the courtiers spoke it fluently. There were games, feasts, pageants, and dances, elaborate masks where identities were hidden and feelings could be tested in plain sight. Henry loved entertainment, music, jesters, tournaments, and his court provided it endlessly. But underneath the sparkle and song was something else, attention, a quiet, ever-present knowledge that fortune could shift in a heartbeat. Even friendships were delicate. Today's ally could become tomorrow's traitor. Some courtiers rose with shocking speed, others vanished, sent away, or worse, their names removed, their portraits quietly taken down. For women, the dance was even more subtle. A well-placed laugh, a drop of the eyes, a gift received at the right moment. These things could mean advancement, but every smile was shadowed by caution. To be noticed was dangerous. To be forgotten was worse. And still, the court continued, as constant as breath, as changeable as wind. People spoke in hushed tones near tapestries, passed folded notes between sleeves, and watched from balconies as others tried their hand at fortune. It was not a place of peace, but it was alive, with ambition, beauty, danger, and dreams. And when the king retired to his chamber at night, his courtiers did not sleep easily, for in dreams, too, power whispered, and sometimes it turned. When we speak of kings, we often imagine thrones and jewels, but perhaps the truest reflections of a monarch are the places they built, the spaces where they lived, ruled, and dreamed. Henry VIII, like many kings, left behind more than just laws and legacies. He left behind buildings, homes made of oak and stone, of glass and gold leaf, of quiet chambers and echoing halls. Each palace was more than just a residence. It was a message, a reflection of his power, his mood, and his need for beauty or control. One of the most beloved of these was Hampton Court Palace. Originally built by Cardinal Wolsey, it became Henry's when the cardinal fell from favor. Tucked alongside the River Thames, Hampton Court was vast and symmetrical, with tall chimneys and red brick walls glowing warmly in the afternoon sun. Its kitchens were enormous, capable of feeding hundreds daily. The great hall was lined with tapestries and polished beams, filled with the hum of court musicians and the rustle of gowns during feasts. Imagine the tiled courtyards, the walled gardens, the paths lined with lavender and rosemary. Picture the king strolling with his dogs, heavy steps echoing off cobblestones, or sitting beneath a carved wooden canopy, watching jesters perform in the flickering torchlight. Then there was Whitehall Palace, a true heart of royal life, though now mostly lost to fire and time. In Henry's day, it was a grand and sprawling estate. full of chambers and courtyards, private galleries and grand halls. Its painted ceilings and gold-edged tapestries shimmered under candlelight. From Whitehall, Henry governed, entertained ambassadors, and received reports of distant events, often while lounging beside a hearth surrounded by velvet drapes. At Greenwich Palace, where Henry himself was born, the river breezes would drift through open arches and catch the edge of lace curtains. The gardens were gentle here, more intimate, softer. It was a place of memories and beginnings. Catherine of Aragon had once held court here. Anne Boleyn had danced beneath its ceilings. The stone stairways knew their footsteps. The windows had watched as laughter gave way to silence. Then there was Windsor Castle, older, grander, more fortress than palace in its origin. But Henry made it his own, filling it with light and ceremony. The view from the upper walls stretched far across the green fields of Berkshire. Inside, the chapel was hushed and beautiful, lined with Gothic arches and colored glass. It was here, in St. George's Chapel, that Henry would one day be laid to rest beside Jane Seymour. And in all these palaces, behind the grandeur and stone, were the quieter rooms, the small libraries with open pages left on desks, the prayer chambers with worn cushions, the narrow stairwells used by servants carrying polished platters. Life in a Tudor palace was not just about pageantry. It was about routines, small sounds, the creak of wood, the crackle of a fire, the murmur of tired voices after a long day. When the court moved, these palaces would come alive again with footsteps and song. But when they were empty, when the fires had cooled and the torches dimmed, they waited in silence. The rooms remembered, and perhaps, in some way, they still do. By the time Elizabeth I was nearing the end of her life, the Tudor line had already narrowed to a quiet thread. No heirs followed her. No children waited in the wings. She was the last leaf on the branch, the end of a family tree that had ruled England with fire, with silk, and with steel. Her reign had lasted 44 years, long and golden, filled with poets, playwrights, and explorers. It had seen the rise of Shakespeare, the voyages of Drake, the strength of a woman who never married, yet held her country together with a firm, steady hand. But even queens grow tired. As the 16th century neared its close, Elizabeth began to retreat more often to her private chambers. The glittering court continued, but behind her white-painted face and jeweled gowns, the queen was aging. Her closest friends were gone, her advisors dead or retired, her ladies grown old beside her. The woman once called the Virgin Queen now sat often in silence, her mind wandering backward. She wore wigs to hide her thinning hair, pearls to brighten a face lined by time. But her eyes still carried the depth of one who had ruled alone, a figure both admired and feared, both celebrated and, in some ways, sorrowful. In her final months, Elizabeth refused to lie in bed. She stood or sat on cushions on the floor, dressed in heavy robes, wrapped in thoughts no one could quite reach. She murmured often of those who had gone before, of Robert Dudley, her beloved friend, of her mother, Anne Boleyn, of her father, Henry, whose shadow had loomed over her life since she was a child. It was the year 1603 when she finally slipped away in the early hours of a March morning. No trumpets, no fanfare, just the soft hush of a life ending, the crown passing, and an age closing like a well-worn book. And with her, the Tudor name passed into history. There was no chaos, no civil war. The crown was handed to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, a peaceful joining of two realms. The Stuarts followed where the Tudors left off, but something had changed. The Tudors had been larger than life, bold, bright, unpredictable. Their portraits stared down from dark wooden walls with confidence and command. Their palaces echoed with music and gossip. Their reign was a chapter thick with drama. Yet now it was over, and yet even in their end they remained. Their symbols, the rose, the crown, the lion, still carved into archways and coins. Their stories still told beside fireplaces and in schoolrooms. Their names whispered on velvet evenings and in candlelit libraries. Henry, Mary, Elizabeth, not just rulers, but myths in human skin. The candle may have flickered out, but the warmth lingered. And so, in the quiet that followed, England turned its page, not with fear, but with memory. The Tudors had come like a flame and gone like a sigh. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a quiet Tudor village in the early morning. Mist hangs low over the fields. The air smells of damp earth, chimney smoke, and wild thyme. Somewhere down the winding path, a woman tends her herb garden, her hands stained green, her apron dusted with petals. Nearby, a child coughs gently in his bed, and someone stirs a steaming pot filled with elderflower and willow bark. This was medicine in Tudor England, a blend of hope and habit, of ritual and root. There were no hospitals as we know them, no antibiotics, no clean white coats. Instead, there were wise women, wandering physicians, monks with books of cures, and mothers who passed down recipes through word and memory. The belief was simple. The body was made of four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness came when these were out of balance, and so healing meant restoring that balance, sometimes with herbs, sometimes with food, and sometimes with leeches. Yes, leeches, placed carefully along a swollen ankle or behind the ear. They were believed to draw out bad blood, to calm a fever, or soothe a pounding head. It sounds strange now, but in those days it was gentle science. More often, people turned to the garden for answers. Nature, after all, was the closest apothecary. Chamomile for sleeplessness, mint for bellyaches, yarrow to stop bleeding, garlic to fight infection, rosemary for memory and mood. These herbs weren't just added to stews. They were crushed into poultices, steeped into teas, tucked beneath pillows, and burned in bundles to cleanse the air. Healing was a sensory experience, fragrant, warm, and touched by superstition. There were also charms, ribbons tied to trees, words whispered over water, pieces of iron placed under mattresses to chase away night terrors. Tudor medicine was as much about the spirit as it was about the body. In larger towns, apothecaries ran small shops filled with strange and wonderful items: dried orange peel, powdered pearls, owl feathers, jars of honey, snakeskins, and pressed flowers between leather pages. The air in these shops was thick with scent, a mix of spice, dust, and damp parchment. Then there were the physicians, often men of learning, trained in Latin texts and university halls. They carried little vials and leather-bound books, and they prescribed diets, rest, and bleeding with solemn certainty. But they were few in number, and their services costly. Most people relied on their own: a grandmother's knowledge, a neighbor's remedy, a prayer muttered at dusk. And when nothing worked, when illness lingered despite all efforts, they lit candles, not out of despair, but hope. The soft glow in a dark room, the warmth of wax melting slowly. it comforted, it steadied the heart. In this world, healing wasn't quick. It was slow, like a sunrise. It meant rest and time and kindness, and sometimes it meant simply sitting beside someone, holding a hand and waiting. Tudor medicine may not have cured much, but it cared deeply, thoughtfully, and with a kind of grace we sometimes forget in modern speed. So, as the fire crackled in the hearth, and the wind whispered outside the shuttered window, someone would gently spoon warm broth to pale lips, smooth a cool cloth across a brow, and hope, always hope. Let your mind drift now to a small Tudor village. Picture it nestled among rolling hills, where thatched roofs peek through morning fog and narrow lanes are dappled with light filtering through oak and elm. The air smells of wood smoke and damp stone, and a soft wind rustles the linen hung to dry between cottages. It's early. The sun is just rising, casting a gold-pink hue across fields still wet with dew. A cock crows. Somewhere a church bell chimes softly, not loud or urgent, just steady and familiar, like a heartbeat in stone. Inside one cottage, a fire crackles to life in the hearth. A woman stirs a pot of pottage, a thick, humble stew of barley and leeks, while a child pulls on wool stockings still stiff from last night's drying. Bread is sliced, coarse and dark, and shared without words. This was how days began in Tudor England, not with rush or noise, but with rhythm. People rose with the sun and worked with their hands. They walked through fields with scythes, milked goats in chilly barns, gathered eggs from straw nests, or sat at looms, weaving wool into cloth. Even children had their chores, fetching water, minding younger siblings, sweeping dusty floors. Yet there was quiet joy in the routine. Life was slower. Days unfolded gradually, marked not by clocks, but by light and sound. The position of the sun, the ringing of church bells, the clatter of hooves on muddy roads. At mid-morning, a break, a bit of ale or cider, safer than water, and a wedge of cheese wrapped in cloth. Then back to work. Lunch came around noon. Another simple meal, perhaps cold meat left from last night, onions, and a small turnip pie. People ate what was local, what was seasonal. Food was not fast nor fancy, but nourishing and made with care. In towns, the streets were livelier. Market stalls bustled with barter and chatter. Fishmongers called out their catch. Bakers offered sweet buns, and blacksmiths hammered iron with rhythmic clangs. Children chased each other between wagons. Pigeons fluttered on windowsills. And all the while, bells marked the hours. They called people to mass, to market, to curfew. Their tones rolled over rooftops and fields, soft and constant. Afternoons passed with more work, more walking, more weaving. But as the sun lowered, a quiet shift took place. The sky turned amber. Shadows grew longer. Fires were rekindled. Candles were lit. Evening brought warmth, not just from the hearth, but from being together. Families gathered around the fire. Some mended clothes, some sharpened tools, some simply sat. A story might be told, a song softly hummed, and then supper, modest, like breakfast, thick broth, warm bread, a boiled apple, no feast, but enough. Afterwards came stillness. The shutters were closed, the doors bolted with wooden beams. A prayer was said, sometimes in the heart, and people drifted to sleep under heavy wool blankets, the scent of smoke and lavender lingering in the air. There were no glowing screens, no humming machines, only the sound of night birds, the distant howl of a fox, or the muffled cough of a sleeping child. And in that quiet, time paused. The world of Tudor daily life was not grand, but it was full of little details. The scrape of a wooden spoon, the flicker of a flame, the soft rhythm of boots on dirt paths. In these simple acts, life unfolded, gently, steadily, like a candle burning low, but never rushed. And so, with the bells now silent and the fields cloaked in shadow, the village sleeps once more. The stars have risen now. The village lies in near-perfect stillness. Only the occasional whisper of wind through bare branches breaks the hush. Inside homes, the shutters are drawn. The hearths burn low, their warmth stretching out into the room in soft, pulsing shadows. In this world of low ceilings and uneven floors, Tudor people prepare for sleep, not with haste, but with slow, familiar movements. The bedding was simple, yet layered with care. Straw mattresses stuffed into linen sacks were laid across rope-latticed bed frames. The ropes pulled tight each evening, hence the old saying, "Sleep tight." On top of the straw lay woolen blankets, perhaps a fur or sheepskin for those who could afford it. Feathers, if one was lucky, coarse cloth for most. In wealthier homes, beds stood tall and carved, their posts heavy, and their canopies draped in dark velvet or homespun linen. Curtains were drawn around the bed, not for romance or display, but to keep out drafts and trap in warmth. In simpler cottages, sleep happened wherever there was space. Children might share a bench pushed against the wall, or a narrow loft tucked above the main room. Grandparents might sleep in the same room as parents, all bundled near the fire. Privacy was rare, but warmth more important. Sleep itself was not taken all at once, as we know it today. Tudor nights were often divided into two sleeps, first sleep and second sleep. People would lie down not long after dusk, drift into their first slumber for several hours, then wake naturally in the middle of the night. During this wakeful period, perhaps around midnight, they might stir the fire, say quiet prayers, reflect on dreams, even visit neighbors or tend to simple tasks. Then, with heavy eyes once more, they would return to bed for the second sleep, which lasted until the early morning light. It was a slower rhythm, one in tune with the body's needs and the world's silences. Dreams were believed to have meaning. A vision of water might signal change. A dream of fire, perhaps anger. The air is cool. Dew clings to the low leaves and sparkles on the petals. Bees hum slowly, still sleepy themselves, drifting from one blossom to another. A small wooden gate creaks open, and footsteps begin to move along the dirt path. In Tudor England, the garden was more than a patch of land. It was life itself, a place to gather not only food, but medicine, scent, and silence. Whether behind a modest cottage or within the stone walls of a manor, gardens were spaces of great care and quiet purpose. The earth was sectioned thoughtfully. There was often a kitchen garden, with neat rows of cabbages, onions, leeks, and turnips. Then, nearby, a herb garden, perhaps round or crescent-shaped, filled with useful, fragrant plants. And further still, maybe a small flower patch for simple pleasure, or even a quiet nook with a bench, shaded by a hazel tree. The herbs were not scattered at random. They were planted with meaning. Sage for wisdom and digestion. Thyme to ease coughs and protect the home. Rue to guard against evil. marjoram to soften sadness, borage for courage in the heart, fennel for clarity of breath. Each morning, before the heat of the sun, someone, often a woman with a basket and gentle hands, would go out to gather what was needed. She knew which leaves to pluck and which to leave. She whispered to the soil, perhaps not aloud, but in thought. The rhythm of tending to the garden was as calming as prayer. Weeding was not a chore, but a meditation. Watering was done by hand, using clay pitchers or wooden buckets from the well. In dry seasons, a bit of cooled cooking water might be saved for the roots of mint and lovage. Nothing was wasted. In monasteries, too, gardens flourished. Monks with quiet footsteps tended them in silence. Their herbals, hand-copied books, filled with notes and pressed specimens, became the medical texts of the time. These monks would write that chamomile eased restlessness, and that lemon balm maketh the heart merry. Even the nobility kept herb gardens, not always to tend themselves, but to show status and knowledge. In great houses, walled gardens were designed in careful patterns, like living embroidery. Walkways were lined with lavender and hyssop. The scent lingered in the folds of dresses and sleeves. But the most special garden was always the one close to the kitchen door. There, a wooden table might sit beneath the overhanging eaves, used for sorting herbs or setting down a basket of beans. Chickens might wander in and out, pecking gently at the soil. A cat might sun itself in the corner, and somewhere, drying on a line, were bundles of rosemary, tied with string and left to crinkle and fade in the warmth of the afternoon. These gardens were not silent, but peaceful. They held the sounds of insects, the soft brushing of leaves, the creak of the gate, and the laughter of someone humming a tune known only to themselves. When illness came to the home, the garden gave its gifts. A handful of mint steeped for stomach pains, feverfew laid upon the brow, calendula petals stirred into warm oil for sore hands. There was belief in these things, and often comfort. At dusk, when shadows stretched long and the sun dipped low behind the hedgerow, the garden would settle again. Birds would roost, the bees would vanish, and the scent of crushed herbs would rise like a soft breath into the cooling sky. And so the garden slept, just as the people would soon, beneath stars and stillness. Close your eyes for a moment. Let your imagination drift. You are lying on a straw-stuffed mattress, wrapped in wool blankets. Outside your wooden window, the world stirs quietly. You can hear it. The first sound is birdsong. The birds of Tudor England were many, and they filled the skies with soft, looping melodies. There were blackbirds singing from rooftops, robins chirping in gardens, thrushes with their bubbling notes, and nightingales, sweet and mournful, singing only at dusk or just before dawn. Their songs were not just background, they were timekeepers. Morning birds marked the beginning of day. Evening birds signaled rest. In places without clocks or alarms, these small feathered voices gently guided the rhythm of waking and sleeping. And then the bells. Tudor life moved to the sound of bells. Church bells rang for many reasons: to signal mass, to mark the hours, to warn of fire, or simply to remind people of the passage of time. Their sound was rich and slow, carried across fields and towns alike. There might be a bell at sunrise, deep and steady, calling people to begin their work. A midday bell would follow, reminding them to pause, to eat, to rest in the shade. And at dusk, another bell, lower now, perhaps softer, signaling the end of toil and the start of quiet. People listened. Even if they didn't look up, they heard. The bells were always there, like the heartbeat of the town. In villages, other sounds joined the chorus. The clatter of cartwheels over uneven stone, the creak of wooden gates swinging closed in the wind, the murmur of a brook behind the baker's cottage, the faint hiss of a pot boiling gently on the hearth. Inside the home, sound was softer, the gentle snap of a log breaking in the fire, the quiet scrape of a spoon against a clay bowl, a baby's breathy sigh, the whisper of wool skirts brushing across the floorboards. People spoke softly in the evenings. Loud voices were from markets and public halls. At home, in candlelight, conversations were low, murmured, like the voice of a storyteller speaking to someone half asleep. In wealthier houses, servants moved quietly. Shoes were removed indoors. Music might play faintly from a lute or pipe, its melody drifting up a spiral staircase and into the beams above. And outside, in the nighttime garden, crickets chirped. The wind moved through the herbs, making a sound like gentle whispers. When it rained, the sound was slow and soft, droplets on thatch, on leaves, on earth, a rhythmic pattering that seemed to hush everything else. It was a sound that made people pause, lean closer to the hearth, and feel the world grow smaller and more peaceful. Even in the city, where life was busier, there were quiet sounds, the hiss of a candle being snuffed, the heavy thud of a tavern door shutting for the night, a cat's padded steps across the cobbled alley, and above it all, at every hour, the wind. In the Tudor world, the wind spoke often through trees, over fields, around chimneys, and through narrow lanes. It didn't shout, it whispered, sometimes playful, sometimes solemn, but always there. And so, as you drift now into deeper sleep, you can imagine yourself wrapped in these gentle sounds, the soft call of a distant bird, the hush of leaves outside your window, the fading echo of a bell across the moor. The fire is lit, a kettle simmers quietly. Outside, the sky is pale with the first light of dawn. Inside a Tudor home, the day begins slowly. Before stepping out into the world, before the hens are fed or the bread is made, there is the quiet, careful task of getting dressed. Clothing in the Tudor era was not simply thrown on. It was layered with care, often requiring help from others, especially in grand households. Even for the humblest cottager, there was a rhythm to dressing that followed both the weather and the day's work. Let us start at the innermost layer, the linen shift. This was the foundation, a long, soft garment worn by women, men, and children alike. It touched the skin directly, protecting outer layers from sweat and oils. The linen was often homemade, spun and woven by hand, washed in cool streams, and dried in the open air. Over time, it grew soft, shaped by the wearer's body. Above the shift, more layers were added. For men, a pair of hose or woolen breeches would be tied at the waist. A doublet, like a snug-fitting jacket, followed its laces gently pulled. In cooler months, a thick wool jerkin might be added, or even a short cloak. The garments were often simple in rural areas, brown, gray, or earth-toned. But even in simplicity, there was dignity. Women's clothing had its own layers. Over the shift, a kirtle, something like a gown or petticoat, was laced up snugly. A bodice gave shape to the upper body, and an apron was tied carefully at the waist. If she worked outdoors, she might wear sturdy shoes and a warm cloak. If she worked indoors, her sleeves could be pinned back neatly and her hair tucked beneath a linen coif or cap. The The colors worn often reflected the wearer's place in society. Soft browns, creams, and grays were common among villagers. These colors came from natural dyes: walnut husks, onion skins, nettles, and woad. In contrast, brighter colors like deep blue, crimson, and golden yellow required more effort and expense. They were often reserved for Sundays, festivals, or the wealthier classes. The fabric textures also told quiet stories. Wool was everywhere, sheared from sheep in spring, spun on drop spindles or wheels, then woven into thick cloth that could hold warmth through long winters. Linen from the flax plant was cooler and finer, often used in undergarments. Silk and velvet, rich and rare, were reserved for the elite, often regulated by sumptuary laws which dictated who could wear what. And yet, even the simplest cloak or apron held a kind of quiet pride. In each garment, there were stitches sewn by hand, often by the same person who wore it. Mending was a normal part of life. A worn patch here, a new piece of cloth added there. Clothing was never thrown away lightly. It was repaired, repurposed, and passed down. Shoes were another story entirely. Many were made of stiff leather, shaped on wooden lasts, and fastened with laces or simple clasps. A common person might own just one pair, worn every day through field, forest, and frost. Children often went barefoot through much of the year, their feet growing tough from earth and stone. Dressing in winter brought extra care. Layers were thicker, hoods were pulled low, hands were wrapped in woolen mitts, and the wind was kept at bay by cloaks fastened with bone or wooden toggles. Still, many parts of the body remained exposed. The face, the hands, the ankles, reminders of nature's presence in everyday life. In noble homes, the process of dressing was even slower, a quiet ritual in the morning light. Ladies' gowns were laced at the back by maids, their sleeves pinned, their ruffs adjusted just so. Lords might sit in silence as servants brought in boots, a fine shirt, or a velvet doublet embroidered with thread of gold. Every layer was purposeful, not just for show, but to display the station of the wearer without a single word being spoken. And yet, beneath all these differences in wealth or station, there was a shared simplicity. Whether in manor or cottage, every person began the day by preparing their body for the world, carefully wrapping it in cloth, tying a ribbon, securing a clasp, and stepping softly into the light of morning. As day unfolded, these clothes would gather the scent of wood smoke, the dust of the lane, and the warmth of the sun. And when evening came, each garment would be removed, slowly and with care, folded beside the fire, hung near the bed, or laid across a chest, ready for another quiet morning. Imagine the air scented with rosemary and wood smoke. It's a quiet afternoon. Outside, there's a breeze in the hedgerow. Inside, the kitchen is alive with gentle motion. Nothing rushed, nothing loud, just the steady rhythm of daily life. In most Tudor homes, the kitchen wasn't a separate room like we think of today. Instead, it was part of a wider hall or multi-use space, often centered around a large, open hearth, the heart of the home. Everything revolved around the fire. At the hearth, cooking pots hang from iron hooks, swaying ever so slightly. A kettle murmurs softly, its surface dimpled with tiny bubbles. The fire doesn't roar. It glows steadily, its embers orange and kind. It gives off heat, yes, but also light, scent, and a sense of quiet reassurance. A woman stirs a pot with a long-handled spoon. She doesn't hurry. The stew, made of barley, onion, and a few precious scraps of meat, must take its time. The longer it simmers, the better it tastes. Near the hearth, a small wooden table holds the tools of daily life. A loaf of brown bread wrapped in cloth, a wedge of hard cheese, a clay jar of honey, a bowl of soft butter, set near the warmth to soften. Beside these, a simple knife, well used but sharp, rests on a board worn smooth by generations. In the corner, bundles of herbs hang upside down from beams: sage, thyme, marjoram, lavender. Their leaves are slowly drying, their scents mingling in the air. Some will season the evening meal, others will be steeped in hot water as calming tisanes, and a few will be tucked into bedding or burned gently to sweeten the air. Children, if present, sit on the floor, shelling peas or threading berries. The youngest may nap nearby, wrapped in a wool blanket. Their small breaths rise and fall in time with the fire's whisper. In grander households, the kitchen might be a separate building, tucked behind the manor to keep heat and smoke away from the main rooms. There, cooks and scullions work in soft silence, tending larger fires and turning spits by hand. Copper pans glint in the light from high windows, and the aroma of roasting meats blends with that of fresh bread cooling on long wooden boards. But even in these great kitchens, the rhythm is slow, deliberate. The fire can't be rushed, nor can the rising of dough or the tender thickening of a sauce made from bone broth, herbs, and patience. Water is fetched from a nearby stream or well, poured into ceramic pitchers and copper pots. It is used carefully, heated for washing, measured for cooking. Every drop is handled with respect. Utensils are simple: wooden spoons, clay bowls, rough ceramic plates, a few pewter cups or iron pans. Forks are rare. Fingers and knives do most of the work, and bread acts as both food and tool, wiping sauce from the bowl, soaking up juices, holding bits of stew. There is no hum of refrigerator, no click of timers, no fan. The only sounds are natural: the hiss of water dropped on hot stones, the crack of a log settling in the fire, the quiet scrape of a spoon against the inside of a pot, and outside the window, the call of a distant blackbird. As the sun begins to lower, supper nears readiness. The food is simple but nourishing: a pottage, thick with oats and garden greens, perhaps an egg, freshly laid, poached in the corner of the pot, a cup of warmed ale or small beer, weak enough for children, yet comforting. Meals are eaten slowly, in gratitude. They are shared with others, or taken alone, in peace. A prayer may be said, not out of formality, but from the heart, for the food, for the warmth, for another day safely passed. Later, when the fire dims, the coals will be banked with ash to keep them glowing until morning. The last crumbs are swept from the table. A few embers flicker against the stone hearth. The kitchen grows quiet again, wrapped in the hush of nighttime. And so ends another day. Not rushed, not forgotten, but lived gently, from spoon to pot, from field to hearth. In the stillness of early morning, before the world is fully awake, the garden already stirs. Soft dew clings to the leaves. A wren sings somewhere in the hedgerow. The breeze carries the faint scent of rosemary and damp earth. This is not a grand garden of statuary and fountains, but a quiet patch of land behind a cottage, or beside a manor enclosed by wattle fencing, sheltered from wind and full of quiet life. Every Tudor household, no matter how modest, tended a garden. It was a place of necessity, but also of care and calm. In warmer months, one might see lettuces soft with dew, or a patch of tender green herbs. The soil is dark and slightly crumbly, turned by hand using a wooden spade, fertilized with compost and ash, and watched daily for signs of change. A garden was never just planted and left. It was checked in the morning and again before nightfall. Was it too dry? Were there beetles? Did the peas need tying? There is sage, thick-leaved and silver green, known to calm the belly and the breath. Lavender, tall and purple, planted along paths, not only for its scent, but to keep moths from linens. Yarrow, soft and feathered, used to stop bleeding and heal wounds. Chamomile, delicate and apple-scented, dried for sleep. The gardener, whether an elderly widow or a young servant, moves with quiet attention. There is no rush. Weeding is done by hand. Watering is slow, often using ladles or buckets drawn from a well. The hands grow calloused, the back bent, but the work is meditative, almost prayerful. Small touches of color brighten the edges. Pale blue cornflowers, golden marigolds, soft white. A small orchard, if space allows, might offer apples, pears, or plums, their branches humming with bees in spring and heavy with fruit in autumn. A gooseberry bush stands quietly in a corner, maybe a single raspberry vine winding gently along the fence. Children, when not needed for chores, might pick strawberries from the edge of a bed or gather dandelions for the stew pot. They learn as they go which plants are safe, which sting, and how to spot ripe from unripe by touch alone. Even in winter, the garden is not forgotten. Beds are covered with straw or brush. Hardy greens still grow in clumps, kale, chard, and bitter herbs. The paths, now damp with frost, are still walked. Old leaves are gathered, tools are checked, and soon, by candlelight, the seed packets are opened, and spring is quietly planned. Bordered with box hedges, with labeled stones or wooden markers identifying each plant in Latin. There, apothecaries or learned stewards tend more exotic herbs: borage, rue, costmary, and tansy. These were gathered not just for flavor, but for health, to soothe sore joints, settle fevers, or bring on restful sleep. And always the air is filled with life, the buzz of bees, the soft flutter of butterflies, the rustle of leaves, and the sound of wind weaving its way through the rows. The Tudor garden was more than a place to grow food. It was a sanctuary of routine and rhythm, a quiet corner where the noise of the world faded, and the simplicity of tending the earth brought a kind of peace. As dusk comes and shadows lengthen, the gardener walks the rows one last time. A few sprigs are picked for supper. The last light warms the stone wall, and the scent of mint rises in the cooling air. The garden sleeps, but it waits, and beneath the soil something always stirs, ready to rise again with the next slow sun. Night has come to the Tudor home. The air is still, but not silent, not entirely. A distant owl calls once, softly. Somewhere in the rafters, a mouse stirs, and from the hallway, the gentle creak of floorboards reminds us that the world hasn't tea-stopped, it's only grown quieter. In this time, in this place, sleep is not something to be rushed into. It is a gentle winding down, a ritual, a slow surrender. Its posts are carved with slow curves, its canopy thick with embroidered drapes, woven from linen or wool. But even the humblest cottage holds its own version. A straw-stuffed mattress laid over a wooden platform, a heavy blanket stitched from patchwork cloth, a pillow just soft enough to cradle the head. but so is loneliness. To prepare for bed is to tend to quiet things. The coals in the hearth are gently banked, glowing behind a screen. A candle flickers low on the table. The last cup of warm ale or milk is sipped in silence. Slippers are set aside. A linen nightshirt, long and loose, replaces the day's heavier garb. Before lying down, a quiet prayer is whispered, not in fear, but in thanks. For the food eaten, the work done, the warmth still lingering in the room. Then, with a long exhale, one lowers into the bed. The mattress, lumpy in places, is stuffed with straw or feathers, held together with ticking. A rough cloth cover stitched by hand. Beneath it, ropes crisscross a wooden frame. Each night, these ropes are tightened to keep the bed firm. Hence the old phrase, sleep tight. Bedding layers vary by the season. In summer, only a sheet and a single blanket. In winter, woolen quilts, furs, and heavy linen piled high. The weight is a comfort, pressing the day away. If the bed is shared, there is no talking once the candles are snuffed. Only breathing, a shift here, a sigh there. Maybe the soft, rhythmic sound of someone already lost to sleep. In the countryside, with no clocks, time is kept by the body. People rise with the sun and sleep when darkness deepens. No alarms, no harsh light, only the natural rhythm of days, marked by hunger, work, and weariness. Children are lulled by stories, passed down by firelight, told in hushed tones. Tales of green woods, noble kings, or clever animals who speak in riddles. In the wealthier manors, a servant may sleep just outside the chamber, curled in a pallet near the door. Even here, the quiet is sacred. Rest is valued, not as escape, but as a gift, a time to heal the body, settle the thoughts, and dream. And dreams, in the Tudor world, are not meaningless. They are watched for signs, for symbols. A cat in a dream might mean company is coming. Water may mean change. To dream of bread is to know comfort. Each one is quietly considered by morning light, pondered over a sip of mead or a bit of cold cheese. As the night stretches on, the world beyond the window fades. No car horns, no phones, only the soft breath of sleeping kin, the occasional pop of cooling wood, and the hush of wind pressing gently against the walls. You might stir once in the night, reaching to adjust the blanket, or to listen for the church bell in the distance, marking the hour with a single solemn chime. But mostly, you remain still, safe, wrapped in the warmth of woven cloth, in the rhythm of steady breath, and in the deep, quiet simplicity of Tudor sleep. And when morning comes, softly, slowly, it brings with it another day, rich with routine and small wonders. But for now, you are still. The world is asleep. And so, perhaps, are you. In the Tudor morning, rising was not a sudden event. It was a soft, gradual return to wakefulness. First, the body stirs beneath layers of wool and linen. Then comes the creak of the bed frame, the slow swing of legs to the floor, and the feel of chill stone or wooden boards beneath bare feet. In a small home, a single room might serve as both bedroom and sitting room. In a grander house, servants move about quietly, laying out garments near the hearth to warm them before the master or mistress rises. Dressing in Tudor times was not simply a matter of pulling on trousers or slipping into a dress. It was a daily ritual, thoughtful, methodical, and layered, quite literally, from the skin outward. Let's begin with the base layer, worn by nearly everyone, rich or poor. A long linen shirt or smock, plain and undyed, was the first thing placed against the skin. For women, it might reach the ankles. For men, just below the knee. This layer was washed most often and changed regularly, absorbing the oils and dust of the body. Over time, these simple garments grew soft with use, stitched and patched lovingly until they could be worn no more. Next came the stays, a kind of stiffened bodice for women, made of layers of fabric and sometimes stiffened with reeds or whalebone. It offered shape, support, and structure. Lacing it took time, usually with the help of another, and it was tightened not cruelly but steadily. Men pulled on hose, tightly fitted leg coverings that reached up to the waist or hips. These were often made of wool, dyed in soft shades of brown, green, or gray. They were fastened with ties or points, small cords threaded through eyelets. Over the shirt, men would wear a doublet, a fitted jacket that buttoned or tied up the front, often padded just slightly. For women, it was a kirtle, a long dress that offered modesty and warmth. Then came the outer garments, gowns, jerkins, cloaks. Each added not only warmth, but identity. A farmer's cloak might be plain wool, heavy and rough. A merchant's coat might show finer fabric and careful stitching. A noble's gown would glimmer with velvet or brocade, though even that richness was often muted. No garish colors, no sudden brilliance, just depth and subtle shine. Women added partlets, small collars, or neck coverings, pinned in place, sometimes edged with lace. Men tied rough collars or simple kerchiefs. Belts were buckled, pouches tied. Hair was pinned, braided, or wrapped. A woolen cap for warmth, a coif for modesty, a felt hat for going outside, and shoes, thick leather, laced or slipped on, scuffed from mud and softened by years of wear. Every item had meaning. A patch spoke of thrift, a brightly dyed trim showed prosperity, a clean collar showed care. Even the poorest wore what they had with dignity, mended, brushed. Children, too, had their own garments, often miniature versions of their parents'. Boys wore gowns until they were breeched at about 7, the age when they were given their first pair of hose and declared more grown than child. Girls, from young ages, learned to pin their coifs, lace their bodices, and walk with hands folded in the quiet way expected of them. The process of dressing could take minutes or nearly an hour, depending on one's wealth and station. But in all cases, it was not hurried. Each tie, each button, each fold was part of a familiar ritual, setting the tone for the day, grounding the wearer in their place and purpose. Once dressed, one stepped out into a world of early light, of warm hearth smoke curling through chimneys, of footsteps on cobblestones or soft paths through fields. The body was now ready, wrapped not only in cloth but in custom, clothed not just for warmth but for belonging. The Tudor kitchen, whether in a grand manor or a simple cottage, welcomed the day with gentle sounds. The crackle of firewood, the low bubbling of something warm in a pot, the quiet shuffle of feet across earthen floors. It was not a kitchen as we know today. There were no cupboards or cold storage, no taps or tiles. Instead, there were stone hearths, broad, blackened by soot, and great iron cauldrons hanging from hooks. There were wooden tables, worn smooth with use, and shelves lined with simple tools, knives, ladles, mixing bowls, pestles, and mortar carved from stone. The first task of the morning was the fire. Even before the family stirred, someone, often the mistress of the house or a servant, would rise to coax the embers back to life. Cold ashes were pushed aside, dry twigs were placed just so, and a single flame was fed until it grew steady and warm. With the fire lit, the room awakened. The air filled with scents both sweet and savory, the yeast of rising bread, the earthy smell of root vegetables, the sharper note of onion or garlic, and sometimes the comforting richness of bacon fat sizzling on a flat iron pan. There was no rush. Meals were made slowly, with quiet repetition and practiced hands. Bread, the cornerstone of most Tudor diets, was baked fresh when flour and time allowed. In wealthier homes, it was soft, white, and light. In the countryside, it was darker, coarse, with bran or rye, sometimes stretched with oats or beans to make it last. Beside the bread, porridge might be stirred for hours, oats or barley simmered with water or milk, a pinch of salt, perhaps a curl of honey if it could be spared. Eggs were gathered warm from hens, nestled gently into baskets. Milk was poured straight from the pail, thick and frothy, and herbs, mint, rosemary, marjoram, were snipped fresh from the garden, bound in bunches, and hung near the fire to dry. In larger kitchens, meat was prepared early, salt pork, perhaps, or dried fish rehydrated in water overnight. These were trimmed, seasoned, and slowly cooked, not for bold flavor, but for nourishment. Spices were used sparingly, not for heat or bite, but for subtle warmth. Nutmeg, cinnamon, cloves, and a pinch of pepper, all precious and carefully stored. Vegetables were peeled and chopped with a wooden-handled knife. Turnips, leeks, cabbages, and peas, grown close to home, harvested in rhythm with the seasons. Nothing wasted, even peelings fed the pigs. The Tudor kitchen was not quiet in the modern sense. There was the thump of kneading dough, the splash of water in a bucket, the low murmur of voices. But it was peaceful, intentional, focused. Everything had its place. The butter churn stood near the door, its handle smooth from years of use. Jars of preserved fruits lined the cool corners, plums, gooseberries, apples, carefully packed with sugar or soaked in vinegar. Baskets of dried beans, bundles of garlic, a wheel of cheese wrapped in cloth, and hanging from the low beams above, long links of dried sausages, smoked slowly over days, adding a gentle, savory perfume to the air. Children often helped, stirring porridge with sleepy arms, grinding grain between stones, or fetching water from the well. These moments weren't chores, but patterns of life, small, quiet teachings passed from hand to hand. Mid-morning, the first meal would be served, often simply, a slice of bread, a bit of cheese, and maybe warm milk or small beer. No hurry, no clutter, just food, warmth, and quiet. Thanks. Because in the Tudor kitchen, nourishment wasn't about indulgence. It was about rhythm, about keeping the body strong, the family connected, and the world moving gently forward. And as the day unfolded, the kitchen remained a place of comfort, always glowing, always welcoming, even long after the sun had set. Beyond the kitchen door, bordered by low stone walls or woven fences of willow, the Tudor garden waited. It was not only a place of beauty, but of usefulness, a living pharmacy, a source of food, and a sanctuary for the senses. The garden, in many ways, was the beating heart of daily survival. Rows of herbs were planted with care, not merely for flavoring stew or seasoning meat, but for their gentle powers to soothe, to mend, to ease. These plants were part of a quiet tradition, one passed down through generations, spoken softly from mother to daughter, and written carefully into the worn pages of household remedy books. there was sage, its green-gray leaves used to cleanse the mouth and quiet sore throats. Mint, cool and sharp, to settle an uneasy stomach or lift a weary spirit. Chamomile, its delicate white blossoms brewed into tea to help one sleep. And lavender, scattered in pillows or dried in sachets, not just for scent, but to calm the nerves and ease melancholy. The physic garden, as it was sometimes called, had order and intention. Tall plants in the back, low-ground creepers near the front, all laid out in tidy beds divided by pebbled paths or boards of wood. In shaded corners, comfrey grew, its thick leaves bound into poultices to help mend broken bones and bruises. Beside it, feverfew, with small daisy-like flowers, often used to chase away headaches. Each herb had its story. Some came from old monastic knowledge, from times when monks tended great cloistered gardens filled with healing lore. Others came from folk wisdom, shaped by trial and error, by trust in nature's quiet kindness. A Tudor woman might bend over the earth in the morning light, hands dirt-streaked, but nimble, plucking a sprig of thyme for cough syrup, or laying out calendula blossoms to dry in the sun. Near the herbs, vegetables were planted, leeks, onions, parsnips, and beans, growing side by side, their roots tangled in friendly proximity. In the summer months, cabbage butterflies fluttered, and in spring, the soil steamed slightly under the warmth of fresh air. There were no chemicals or fertilizers. Instead, compost made from kitchen scraps, ashes from the hearth, and manure from livestock gently fed the ground, keeping the cycle whole and continuous. Fruit trees bordered the garden if space allowed. Plum, apple, quince, their branches pruned with care. Their blossoms welcomed each spring like old friends returning. Children played nearby, sometimes helping to water or weed, other times just watching bees move from bloom to bloom, fascinated by the quiet dance of nature. The garden was not only a place of work, it was a refuge. A woman might pause with a handful of marjoram, inhaling deeply. A man might kneel in the soft soil, his thoughts wandering peacefully as he weeds between rows of sage. The elderly might sit on a bench in the shade, warmed by the scent of rosemary and the gentle drone of bees. When someone in the house fell ill with a cough, a fever, or just fatigue, the garden offered help, a warming tea, a soothing balm, a cooling cloth soaked in herbal infusion. Not all remedies worked, and not all ailments passed, but the act of preparing them, of stirring, steeping, and trusting the earth, offered comfort in itself. Even in towns, where land was scarce, herbs grew in pots on windowsills, or in shared plots behind narrow lanes. A sprig of rue, a handful of fennel, enough to remind people of nature's presence, even in the midst of cobblestone and chimney smoke. And so, season by season, the garden gave its gifts. It healed, it nourished, it taught patience. It reminded those who tended it that life, though fragile, could be tended with care, grown with gentleness, and made more whole through time and sunlight. When twilight settled over the village or manor, and the golden haze of sunset painted the wooden beams and stone walls in warm hues, music would often begin, not with great ceremony, but with familiarity, with stillness, with slow hands tuning a string, or a voice humming a quiet tune passed down through years. The music of the Tudor age was rich in tone, but gentle in spirit. In grand homes, there might be musicians employed, men who could read notes inked carefully onto parchment, who held lutes or viols with practiced hands, and filled the room with soft harmonies, while candles flickered and shadows stretched. But in most places, cottages, modest manors, village greens, music was simpler, humbler, and just as soothing. A lute might rest in the corner, its pear-shaped body carved from polished wood, strung with gut strings, and tuned by ear. Its notes, when plucked gently, shimmered like soft light across a still pond, clear but never sharp, perfect for evenings when hearts needed lightening or thoughts needed guiding gently toward sleep. The psaltery, a kind of small harp or zither, could sit in one's lap, its strings stretched across a wooden soundboard. A player would touch it with fingers or quilt-tipped sticks, drawing from it the most delicate of voices, like whispering wind through tall grass. The recorder, small, carved of ash or boxwood, was a popular companion to its sound was breathy and pure, like a soft sigh. A child could learn it, and an elder could carry its melody without strain. Songs sung in the Tudor evening were rarely for performance. They were for gathering, for remembering, for easing the heart. Often the words were simple, about love, nature, the passing of time. Lyrics that told of blackbirds and roses, of faith and seasons, of waiting and hope. Some tunes were religious, carried from church to home, their harmonies quiet and measured. Others were folk ballads, tales of millers and maidens, forests and faraway hills, often with lullaby-like refrains that circled back on themselves, like rocking cradles. Imagine a family by the hearth, the fire low, the meal finished, the evening calm. A young woman plucks at a lute while a grandfather hums along. A mother rocks her baby to a tune her own mother sang. Outside, an owl calls once, then settles again into the quiet. In such moments, music became a kind of gentle thread, stitching people together, linking the day to the night, binding memory to the moment. In villages, groups might gather near inns or in common yards. A fiddler might arrive, bow in hand, and strike up a tune, slow enough for waltzing, but steady enough to lift spirits. Not for dancing in frenzy, but swaying, soft movements, shared smiles, and a sense of belonging. Even laborers, after long hours in the field, might hum while tending tools or walking home. Their songs didn't need instruments. Their rhythm was their work. Their voice was enough. And as night deepened, so too did the music. Lullabies were sung not only for children, but for tired souls. Melodies without words sometimes, just a tune carried from memory, like a comfort too old to need explaining. By candlelight or by the glow of a dying hearth, music made the Tudor world feel closer, smaller, safer. Long before the invention of electric light, the days were ruled by the sun and the night by flickering flame, as the sky turned from gold to indigo and finally into velvet black. Families knew it was time to close shutters, bank the fire, and prepare for the long hours of rest ahead. The beds of the time were both practical and, in many homes, lovingly crafted, but to keep out the chill and trap the warmth from shared bodies and the slowly cooling room. The mattress was stuffed with whatever material one could afford: straw, feathers, wool, or flax. It rested atop a lattice of ropes, woven tightly and secured to the wooden bed frame. This gave rise to the familiar saying, "Sleep tight," as the ropes needed to be pulled taut to support the mattress properly. Over the mattress lay linens, usually coarsed by today's standards, but cared for with pride. Sheets were made from linen flax and bleached in the sun. These sheets were topped with thick blankets, often of wool, and then with a coverlet, sometimes quilted, sometimes woven, sometimes simply pieced together by hand over many winters. Pillows varied. The poor might have none at all, or a small one stuffed with straw. Night clothes, too, had their place. Men might wear long linen shirts, while women wore night shifts, simple and loose. These garments were designed not only for modesty, but to offer warmth during the long hours when fires burned low and windows let in winter's breath. Before bed, there were small customs. Might be sipped slowly to bring sleep. A prayer was spoken softly, heads bowed, candles snuffed. The household would quiet, one room at a time, until even the cats curled up in silence. Families often slept together, especially in colder months. Children were tucked in with care. Mothers might hum them to sleep or whisper stories from memory of saints, of seasons, of animals that talked and woods that watched. Sometimes sleep came in two parts, what we now call first and second sleep. A person might doze in the early evening wake for a time in the middle of the night to pray. This segmented pattern was natural, shaped by candlelight and the pace of undisturbed life. And so, dreams drifted gently over the Tudor sleeper, dreams of fields and feasts, of songs and sermons, of things longed for and things remembered. But for now, under wool and wood and winter stars, they rested. As you rest now, perhaps, listening to the soft turning of these old pages, letting your mind settle like linen folded in a chest. In the slow rhythm of Tudor days, animals were constant, always present, sometimes in the background, often at the center of life. They kept the mice at bay, especially in pantries, where precious stores of grain and cheese were kept. They were often called by sweet names, Malkin, Grimalkin, or Tomkin, and were known by every member of the house. These Tudor cats were rarely groomed or pampered as today, but they were fed scraps and offered warm places to sleep. Their independence was respected. They came and went, sometimes disappearing for days, only to return as if nothing had passed. Dogs, too, were beloved. The small lapdogs of noblewomen, often referred to as comforters, nestled in skirts or curled on cushions near the feet of their owners. Breeds like the spaniel or bichon were prized not for hunting, but for warmth and affection. These little dogs were sometimes even used to soothe aching joints or to warm hands during long carriage rides or chilly chapel visits. In more rural homes, larger dogs, such as mastiffs or terriers, served as guards or herders. They slept outside the doors or beneath carts, ever alert, and would bark only when truly necessary. Their presence was comforting, part of the landscape of the home. Cows gave milk, hens laid eggs, geese and ducks wandered the yards. Pigs, often left to roam during the day, returned at night and were as familiar as family. Their oinks, clucks, and lowing were the natural music of a Tudor morning. Children knew the animals by sight and often by name. They helped gather eggs, brushed the backs of ponies, and played near the sheep while the sun hung low over the hills. Even in the great halls of nobility, animals found their way in. Queen Elizabeth I herself was said to be fond of small dogs, and in many paintings of the period, a lapdog can be seen tucked beneath a velvet hem or peeking from a sleeve. In times of grief, animals were comfort. In times of joy, they were part of the laughter. They did not speak, but they listened. They did not rule, but they followed. And in their soft breathing and quiet movements, they reminded even the busiest of souls to pause and be present. At night, the barn grew still. Chickens roosted, horses nuzzled each other, cats returned to hearths, dogs circled once and lay down. And the Tudor world fell asleep. Not just its people, but its creatures, too. In the calm hush of early morning or the soft golden light of late afternoon, the Tudor garden was a sanctuary. It was not always grand, nor filled with exotic blooms, but it was tended with care, shaped with patience, and cherished for the peace it brought. Behind many a cottage, or nestled beside a manor house, one could find a kitchen garden, carefully arranged in neat rows. It was a patch of earth filled with usefulness, herbs for medicine, vegetables for the table, and flowers for the soul. Paths were simple, sometimes trodden earth, sometimes stone, winding gently through beds, edged with woven twigs or low walls of stone. Bees drifted lazily from blossom to blossom, and butterflies fluttered like living petals on the breeze. The scents here were soft but rich. There was lavender, with its gentle purple blooms, used to scent linens and calm the mind. Rosemary, sharp and woodsy, said to strengthen memory. Sage, silvery and still, gathered for both supper and salves. And thyme, creeping close to the soil, its tiny flowers, beloved by bees. These were not just plants, they were threads in the fabric of daily life. Women would gather mint for infusions, chamomile for sleep, and marjoram for quieting the breath. A sprig placed in bathwater, a handful dried and hung in the pantry, a small bouquet laid on a windowsill. These were small acts of love, carried out again and again, season after season. Closer to the manor, gardens might take on more formal shapes. Inspired by medieval cloisters or the blossoming designs of the Renaissance, noble gardens were divided into neat squares and circles, their symmetry bringing a sense of calm order to the eye. Fountains murmured softly in corners. Birds sang from hedges trimmed with care. Roses climbed wooden frames, and daisies nodded in the breeze. In the center of such gardens, there was often a bench or stone seat, placed not by accident, but for the purpose of sitting quietly, of listening, of watching shadows stretch and contract as the day drifted by. The Tudor garden was not rushed. It asked for slow hands and a patient heart. Seeds planted in spring might take months to bloom, but the act of tending them, the soft press of earth, the watering, the weeding, was a ritual of comfort. Children played at the edges, chasing each other past tall sunflowers or picking gooseberries with stained fingers. Old men sat with canes resting beside them, watching the birds peck at crumbs. Women knelt by herbs, fingers gently crushing leaves between thumb and forefinger, releasing scent and memory. And when the day ended, the garden grew quiet again. Petals closed. Bees returned to hives. The sun dipped low behind the hedgerows. And perhaps, just as you are now, someone stood still in that hush, breathing deeply, letting the calm of the garden fill them, and feeling in their chest the quiet satisfaction of a day well tended. And now, as our time in the Tudor world draws to a close, allow yourself to rest just as they did. Let the gentle rhythm of history lull you, the soft sense of thyme and lavender drift around you, and the memory of simpler days settle quietly into your thoughts. You are safe here, wrapped in blankets of story and stillness. Good night. If you'd like a new script on another historical topic in the same style,